Nice to meet you in person.
Yes, it's a pleasure, yes.
Even though...
Yes, it's nice to put names to all the faces I see on Stack Exchange.
Exactly, exactly. Can I go for the first question? Can I?
Absolutely, please do.
Well, I would like to start out with some of the stuff that I really learned from David Walden, which is to ask people first to tell us a little bit about their background and independently of tech. And
well, my background is originally a fairly sort of straight academic background in philosophy. So I graduated in philosophy in, gosh, 1988, University of Warwick in the UK. And then I went on to, and mostly analytic philosophy, logic, metaphysics, philosophy of science, that sort of thing. And then I went on to do artificial intelligence in Edinburgh, a master's degree, and then I did cognitive sciences PhD in Edinburgh. And after that, I sort of had the usual piles of student debt. And so I went on to, this was in the sort of boom period, sort of mid-late 90s in the UK, where if you knew how to use a keyboard, you could become an IT consultant. So I did that, and I sort of bluffed my way into a consultancy job with British Telecom by literally reading a nutshell book on TCP on the bus on the way to the interview. And luckily they asked me questions to do with what I just read in the book on the way there. And so I sort of started off, I don't even remember what I was doing. We were hacking some Unix systems for British Telecom, and this was like this was 1998 actually, 1998. Sorry, yes. And so I stayed in that sort of area for several years to pay off the debts, and moved around and did a few years at HP as an external consultant. I'm not as an HP consultant, but as an external contractor working on HP site in Scotland. And I knew I didn't particularly want to be doing that forever. It was just useful to pay off the bills. And then my background in philosophy, I'd still been reading a lot of philosophy and a lot of psychology, and I ended up looking into becoming a psychoanalyst. And so at that point, I sort of went through the stages of looking for where to go to do this. I wanted to do the sort of Jungian general approach. It turned out the best place to do this, if you wanted to still work and actually earn a living, and was to go to Switzerland to the original Jung Institute. So that's what I eventually did. I planned to do actually. So I started to do the preliminary work for this, and then there was a sort of IT crash in the UK, early 2000s, and so basically I just ran out of money, and then had to go, and I just had to sort of give that up for a while, and I went to work in the Netherlands for a while, and then in Belgium for a while, saving up money. And then I sort of said, well, it's now or never. And then I moved to Switzerland and just started this training at the Jung Institute there, which went on for quite a few years, with me working in IT and going back there and working in IT, and then eventually managed to find a job in Switzerland in IT so I could do both. And that went on for a few years, and I got married and moved to the US for a few years and did clinical work there, and then moved back to Switzerland, and a lot of backwards and forwards and messing around. And eventually I sort of settled back in Switzerland in about 2008. And still did some consultancy work, IT work, but I finished off the training there at the Institute, and eventually I was on the board of directors of the Institute, and then became the vice president there for a while. And now I have a private practice as a psychoanalyst, Jungian psychoanalyst in Zurich, in Switzerland. And I still do some IT consultancy, but yeah, that's my sort of slightly peculiar background in that, yes.
Wow, quite a journey.
Yeah, it was a lot of moving around. I'm sick of moving countries. I hate it. I really hate it.
How does tech fit into it? When did you get interested in tech?
That was in 91, when I moved to do my master's degree in Edinburgh in AI. And the AI department in Edinburgh at the time, it's funny to think of it because it actually burnt down. It was a big story at the time. It was like one of the oldest AI departments in the world, one of the first. and it burnt to the ground. I think this was quite a few years ago now. And everything, including the only copy of my master's thesis, went up in smoke. Everything just, it was a big disaster at the university at the time. And because they were a very traditional sort of AI department, they had, when you arrived there, they had only HP Unix machines. There were no Windows machines, which you were used to, no Word. It was just old HP Unix machines, and everything, all documentation had to be done in LaTeX. And there was just no sort of nice GUIs anyway, right? And there were no, X Windows was all running in black and white. There were no color screens. It was very sort of hardcore old school AI department. And so everything had to be done in LaTeX. I mean, it was just assumed that was how you were trained to write all documentation or do your thesis, everything. So it was just sort of from day one, we were just sort of pushed into that. And I quite liked it because it was, you know, it was documents as code, and I quite liked that. And so, and this was in the early days before LaTeX 2E. And so that was in my master's degree. We were just forced to do it. Everything, we were just, well, from day one, we were just forced to do it. And it was, you know, relatively fun, really. And we got, and in the same, when I did my PhD in the cognitive science department in Edinburgh, that was the same. Everything, the only difference was they had Sun workstations instead of HP workstations, and everything was LaTeX. My PhD was in LaTeX, everything. And so there was a very, very hardcore LaTeX community there with lots of hackers, and so it was an easy environment to get into it with. But when I left that, then, you know, this was in the days before there were any reasonable home distributions of LaTeX. There was no MikTeX really at the time, and MacTeX, nobody had Macs anyway at that time, and so in the UK anyway, it was too expensive. And so there was just, so I went back to using Word, which was just horribly painful. I mean, I remember just hating it for years, and it wasn't until I started writing the thesis for the Young Institute in about 2007, that I thought I'd investigate LaTeX again. So there was a huge, you know, sort of years and years in the wilderness of not using LaTeX. And then I went back to it and found, oh, there's these marvelous distributions. I found MikTeX. I moved to Macs because of the Unix subsystem. I found MacTeX, and I thought, oh, okay. And I got back into Emacs again. And so I started using it. There was a whole phase where I moved away from it, and then I came back to it in about redemption in about 2007.
Oh, how do you mix the two things, the work in psychiatry and the work in tech?
I don't. I don't really. I mean, I still do a bit of, I still do some IT consultancy. So, but even that, you know, that's not used in most large companies anyway. So I don't. It's a totally separate thing, and it's quite nice because I always considered the sort of IT side of things and sort of computing to be a nice, concrete, non-abstract compensation for. I still do quite a lot of work in philosophy. So philosophy and psychoanalytic work is very non-linear, and you don't generally get nice clean solutions in anything. So it's nice to come to a computer where somebody says, here's a bug report, and you can just fix something and it's fixed, unlike people. And so this is, it's a nice compensation, but it has literally nothing to do. I mean, I do all my invoicing and things like this for my practice with LaTeX, obviously, but it's not part of the work.
Are you doing e-consultations during the pandemic? Are you?
Oh yes. I mean, it's in Switzerland. They did it quite well. They planned it quite well. I mean, they're very, very organised in Switzerland. So the health authority immediately got on top of this and authorised, you know, remote sessions immediately for everybody. So yes, I basically stayed at home a lot and did remote sessions with Skype with people, which was actually relatively straightforward. I mean, the pandemic actually made very little difference to me.
Can you take a consultation right now?
Probably, yeah. What's wrong?
Well, I mean, I feel extremely tired attending these lectures online. You know,
you mentioned, yeah.
It's probably my fourth or fifth conference, and I kind of blame it on the lack of connection and the lack of seeing the full body language of the person.
Well, it's absolutely. I mean, there's research on this. I mean, it's clear that the problem is with with engaging with the screen is that, I mean, for example, I mean, I'm sat in my office, and now my peripheral vision, well, most of my vision of what's going on is peripheral vision. I mean, I can see the whole room, the windows, the trees outside, everything, right? And when you're physically in a conference and you're physically watching someone, you're generally just watching a person and you're listening to what's going on in the room. But if you're sat watching a screen, this just isn't the case. I mean, there's ambient noise and peripheral noise and distractions, and this takes, and so you're basically parallel processing a lot when you're looking at online things, which just takes a lot more energy. It's quite a lot of energy. I mean, you know, multitasking and multifocusing and maintaining a sort of peripheral awareness of what's going on semi-consciously just takes up energy. And so, I mean, online seminars and online courses is all very nice, but they actually, there's quite some quite good research to show that they're actually more exhausting in terms of concentration and cognitive effort, because there's just an awful lot more peripheral distraction.
Talking about peripheral distractions and peripheral noise, I have seen some other interviews of yours where there is a beautiful sound of a clock that interferes.
Oh, that's the church. That's the church opposite. This is a very Swiss thing. Right? I live in a small village, and I live right opposite the church. And this is one of those churches that makes no concessions to the modern world whatsoever. So it rings every single quarter of an hour. It rings once on the quarter hour, twice on the half hour, 3 times on the 3/4, and then it rings the hour. And it does that 24 hours a day without exception. And not only that, there's special times which coincide with what used to be farming signals, because it's a lot of rural Switzerland is farming, still very farming oriented. And so for example, it rings a 2-minute ring at 6 o'clock in the morning, again at 23 minutes past 7. And these tiny Swiss churches have GPS in them. So I'm not joking, they have GPS, so they ring exactly at 23 minutes past 7. I mean, you can set your watch by them literally. And they do that also at 1 o'clock. 23 minutes past 1. I don't know what the 23 minutes past thing is. 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. And so it's constant bells. And I really like it now. I mean, I've seen people visiting just say it would drive them mad. But when it stops and they do maintenance on the clock, something's wrong with the world. I think there's something's missing. What's going on? And you don't know what it is for a few hours. Oh, the bell's not ringing. So you get used to it. So it is. I really like it. But some people, it drives them absolutely mad.
I just want to advise our listeners that if it rings, we'll stay.
Well, what time is it now? No, you're all right now. It's only going to ring the hours, and you won't really hear it in this room. But if it was a sort of 23 minutes past 7, you'd hear it for a while.
Because it's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Oh, it's lovely.
Yeah. So moving over to tech, I wanted to ask you, you already said a little bit about, how your relationship to tech evolved. But what I want to ask a more specific question, how production of documents evolved during your lifetime, during the first time that you started producing documents up to now? Because I see that you do produce a lot of documents yourself. And
I mean, it's strange because in some respects I feel, I mean, apart from the sort of development work on Biber and BibLaTeX, I'm not much of a sort of tech, power user really. I mean, I have a sort of set of templates I use for bits and pieces and for publishing papers and things, but I feel a bit sort of embarrassed sometimes when I see some of the incredibly complicated questions coming in for BibLaTeX, and I think, I have no need for this feature at all. I will never ever use this. Like, nothing even close. It's but I'm happy to make it work for somebody else, but I will never need anything that complicated because my needs are quite basic, really. And in the humanities sort of publishing world, in journals and books, you always end up. I do everything in LaTeX, but then I always end up having to use some dreadful piece of software from Adobe or something that converts it into a Word file from PDF, because nobody will accept, they won't even accept PDF. I mean, it's a lot of humanities publishers. You have to send in Word documents, which is just awful. But so I don't, my document production went from doing a lot of complicated LaTeX stuff for my PhD with all sorts of I did this stuff with these special logic systems, which required these special, it was a very odd notation called, what was it called? Discourse representation theory, which had all these boxes and stuff. And we did all of it in LaTeX, and the lecturers would provide special macro packages, and it was quite complicated. And now, I mean, if I have to put something in bold, it's exciting. I mean, it's just not really, I don't really do particularly exciting typesetting anymore. So I get my sort of fix of exciting typesetting from working on BibLaTeX and reading text.stack exchange.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question about, I mean, you seem to have come to Biber first and then.
Right, yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, now that was a bit of a strange story because so in about 2000, so when I was writing my thesis for the Young Institute, I needed to, oh no, it wasn't that. I was sending a paper to a journal, and they required American Psychological Association bibliography format. And so, I went back into BibTeX and for the first time in years, and I was looking around, and I quite quickly came across BibLaTeX and thought, no, I'm going to use this is better. I'll use this instead. And this was in the days when a chap called Philip Lehman, the original writer of BibLaTeX, who sort of mysteriously disappeared about 10 years ago, which is why I took over it. He was sort of heavily doing this, and I started, and I looked for an APA association BibLaTeX style, and there was none. So I thought, well, I'll write the style for that then. I started to write the style for the APA. And then I came across some things that needed to be done to implement the APA style, which I just couldn't work out how to do. And I contacted Philip Lehman, and we had the discussion, and he said, well, you can't really do this in BibLaTeX. It has to be done by the back end, which currently is BibTeX. And he said, but there's this other chap who's implementing a special backend for BibLaTeX called Biber, and this chap was Francois Charette, who originally started Biber, the very, very early phases of it. And he said, why don't you contact him and see how that's going? So I contacted him, and it turned out that he was writing this custom backend for BibLaTeX, or Biber, and so I tried it out. I found a bug with it, and I submitted a bug report, and he said, why don't you help me develop this, because we need, this is BibTeX too limited for what BibLaTeX needs. So I said, and this was in 2009, early 2009. And so I started helping him sort of develop Biber a bit and do things. And then, and that was when it really snowballed, and we started developing that together heavily in 2009. And that sort of went on for a year or so. And then we were heavily collaborating with Philip Lehman and BibLaTeX. And then Francois Charette didn't have the time anymore, and he just sort of left it to me. So and eventually it got completely rewritten. So there isn't a line of the original code left in Biber anymore. And that was sort of late 2009 or early 2010, I believe. And so, yes, I was involved in Biber first, and then for a few years it was just Philip Lehman on BibLaTeX and I on Biber. We were just collaborating on timing releases of both of them for a while. And then he disappeared. He just stopped answering emails, and I tried to contact him, and I still don't know to this day what happened. He just disappeared. And I asked around, and because I knew more about the BibLaTeX code than most people, because I'd been closely involved with him working on it, there was really no choice. And I sort of, did the whole messing around with GitHub and was it SourceForge at the time to get ownership of the project, and took it over in about 2012, something like that.
Uh-huh.
And I just want to say one thing quickly before I forget, because I think I want to send a big thank you to Moritz Wemhoyer, who I think is probably watching. I saw his name on the participant list, and in the last couple of years he's come on board to the BibLaTeX team, and he's done fantastic work particularly with localization and styles and things like this, and so he's really taken on, a serious load of the BibLaTeX development in the last couple of years, and that without that it wouldn't have been possible, because it was getting too much.
Is it are the two entities married to each other, Biber and BibLaTeX today, or are there other clients for Biber?
There are other clients because Biber has this. I mean, basically they are married. I mean they're developed in lockstep, and they're. I mean, you know, it's 90% of it is a complete marriage of technology. So it's not really Biber as a standalone tool is possible because we implemented quite a few years ago now a tool mode in Biber, which allows you to take in bib files and spit out bib files and do various things to them in the process. So you can sort of mess around with your bibliography databases without actually typesetting anything. And this is known as tool mode in Biber, and it's reasonably sophisticated now. You can do all sorts of things to reformat and mess around with the data semantically. So there is a user base for Biber outside of that, but it's not particularly large, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Let me move over to Unicode and ask you a few questions. What are the hardest part of dealing with the Unicode and implementing sorting and making both of them understand Unicode well?
That was one of the hardest things. However, I mean, I can't claim much virtue in this respect because I use a very nice Perl module, which is part of the standard Perl distribution Unicode collate module, which is written by, I forget, a Japanese chap, and it's very, very good. And that follows the Unicode updates and standards quite closely with updates. So the actual implementation of the Unicode collation algorithm, I have not done that because that would be insane. And it's, I submitted some enhancements and bug reports on that over the years just to get some of the features we wanted into Biber, but I basically use a library that implements the Unicode collation algorithm. Now the difficulty was implementing a reasonable multi-field sorting algorithm for bibliography data, because it's quite difficult, because what you want to do is you want to have it so that people can sort bibliographies on arbitrary bibliography data in the most flexible way possible, which means you have to have a proper multi-field sorting algorithm. So you want to be able to sort, for example, by author, then by title, then by year, then by volume, then by whatever. And all of those, you want to be able to do those descending and or ascending on each of the fields. You want to be able to turn off case sensitivity in each of the fields independently. You want to be able to switch your sorting locale between each of those fields independently, all of which you can do with Biber. And the difficult part also is for names. It's basically constructing the data structure for sorting is quite hard, because the Unicode collation algorithm is very nice. It allows you to just sort arbitrary strings basically, but you have to somehow construct a data structure and the strings in that data structure in order to sort them. And that was the difficult bit, in order to do this in a sort of consistent way. And that took a few iterations. It's now quite a complicated data structure with a lot of optimizations in it so that we can short circuit sorting, because it's by far the most compute intensive thing that Biber does. If you profile it, most of the time is spent in the collation algorithms for any large bibliography. So it took a bit of a while to get that sorted out, and it was one of those sort of painful excursions into sorting algorithms and things like this that I'm not really a sort of a low-level algorithmic hacker at all. So it was somewhat painful to have to do that, but it's reasonably nice now. And all I really have to do now is follow updates in the modules that implement the Unicode collation algorithm and release new versions of Biber with the updated modules. And I don't really have to mess about too much with the actual sorting algorithms themselves inside Biber, because they're quite stable now. As of about 4 or 5 years ago, I settled on a particular way of doing it, which seems to be fairly stable now.
And any updates you just imported through the Pro package maintained by this Japanese guy?
Yes. I mean, because all that really does is it just pulls in all the latest UCA updates and the latest key generation algorithm in the key generation data files, and so I don't really maintain any of that. That would be an awful job to do.
Mm. Do you think the ecosystem, the tech ecosystem, needs a revolution to stay relevant, or do you think that this is going to exist forever?
Well, I think there's pretty much a good underground movement that requires a certain level of typesetting, and there always will be, and so it's not going to go away. From my point of view, the thing that's really made a difference is things like overleaf and sheer LaTeX, and historically that you need GUIs. I mean, you have to make it appealing to people with GUIs, and that's the way the world is now, and it has been for some time. So I can see. So in general terms, LaTeX, I think you're going to need to just hide code from people. I mean, that's just the way everything goes now. But in terms of academic publishing and specialist publishing, which will always be there, then I think it's always going to be relevant, just because you just can't do things outside of that ecosystem. I mean, it's just incredibly difficult to do really decent typesetting in any of the standard high street packages for any of this stuff. It's just awful, and so I don't see it's going to particularly grow until you can just isolate people from seeing any code at all, because the last couple of generations of kids, I mean, they're used to apps, and that's just, you're just tapping bright colorful buttons, and that's not going to change for generations. So I don't see any particular growth there. One thing that would make a big difference, which I'm not seeing a lot of movement on, but I'm not particularly familiar with what's going on there, is in terms of journal publishing and academic publishing. I mean, I know a lot of technical journals, for example, have tech workflows, but for bibliography management, a lot of those are based on BibTeX still, and that's partly because it's very hard to change, historical, complicated pipelines for journal publishing. But it's also, there's a technical limitation in BibLaTeX, because the thing about BibTeX is that just standard old BibTeX is when you run BibTeX, you get a file that is the typeset representation of your bibliography. Your BBL is you just include it, and that's it, and that's the typeset bibliography. With BibLaTeX, it's completely different, and the BBL that you get out of it is not a typesettable document. It's effectively a tech macro database of your bibliography, and then you have to still apply a style to that during the final PDF output, and that makes it an awful lot more flexible, and you can do things you can't do in BibTeX. But it also makes it very difficult for journals to implement in their pipelines when they want someone to just send them the typeset bibliography. There are hacks to sort of do this I've seen kicking around, but there's no easy way of doing this with BibLaTeX. Your bibliography is not a standalone typesettable file. It's all pulled in from various bits and pieces during the final processing.
So that's what keeps the publishers away from BibLaTeX for.
It's certainly what keeps some of them away, yes, because they just don't have it, because they want, when you submit bibliography, they just want a typesettable file that you give them that's using one of their BST files, and there's no easy way of doing that with BibLaTeX, unfortunately, unless they redid their whole pipeline of things, which for most publishers the margins are so small, particularly academic publishers, that the motivation for redoing their entire publishing pipeline is incredibly small.
Do you use tech to submit your papers?
I write them all in tech, but I almost always have to convert them from PDF to Word or something horrible in order to send them, because they just won't. Because a lot of them are using, for example, Routledge or Blackwell. They use these quite sophisticated online submission things for journals now, and they're quite nice and they work very well. But you have to send it all in Word. They work natively with Word, and that's it.
How do you feel by putting this work into a document and not see it coming out in the journal?
I don't like it. I mean, I don't think any of us like that, right? I mean, but there's sort of, I mean, this is something it's a bigger topic about certain types of cultural phenomena that I often have with sometimes with patients and often with students in the past, that there are certain sort of sophistications and discriminated positions that matter independently of whether or not they're practical or not. And so, yes, it would be easier for me to just write all this stuff in Word and just submit it. But there are some things that, typesetting and making things look nice is intrinsically more structured and more developed than not doing it. And so there's an intrinsic value in that, which it doesn't really matter to me whether it's practical or not. And that's I mean, I know that sounds a little bit abstract, but I tend to think that's a rather important principle in general. You shouldn't try to be too efficient in life. There are consequences for doing that. So I'm quite happy with, wasting time typesetting something in a really nice way and then having to export it to Word, which removes everything. That's all right.
I have, I am a producer of publishers' workflows, and for the first time in my life, I'm producing a workflow for a publisher down in Brazil, which uses BibLaTeX. Exactly because they have problems sorting bibliographies, which use.
Oh, really?
And they are sick of BibLaTeX. They're sick of BibTeX, because of the sorting algorithms, and they have explicitly asked for BibLaTeX, and which was my first. I was in fact very, very surprised. I thought they were.
I'm surprised to hear it. Yeah. I'm glad to hear it.
But is there anything that can be done to ease the path? I mean, because it's really painful to be able to use the facilities of programmable bibliographies and not seeing some of the results later on. It's really,
yes.
Is there anything that we can do to ease that?
I don't know. I mean, I've thought about it a little bit. I mean, there have been some suggestions I've noticed on Stack Exchange of trying to, sort of extract the processing of the bibliographies out to a separate file. But this is, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not a particularly brilliant tech hacker. And I think Philip Lehman, the original author of BibLaTeX, was a lot better at it than I am. And a lot of other people are. I think there's been some comments, I don't know if Joseph Wright's on here, but I mean, it required Joseph Wright levels of skill to do that kind of hacking the underlying page dumping algorithms to actually get, something like BibTeX output from BibLaTeX. I don't think I've got the skill to do that, but maybe we will be able to, have some kind of thought about this. But as I remember, it somewhat depends on some of the LaTeX 3 stuff coming out. So, and we've already started to move BibLaTeX toward LaTeX 3 a little bit, but yeah, that's going to be a bit of a job to get it all over. And once it is, I think there's a few more options in that direction. But right now, that's the discussion thread on Stack Exchange.
Well, I'd like to invite people that if they have any questions to ask you to come and join us. I mean, the panelists can do that by themselves, and the attendees all over the world can wave, and I'll upgrade them to a panelist so that they can ask the question themselves. Would you mind that?
That's fine.
Cool. So, I mean, if you have any questions, just please unmute yourself and come online.
Well, I can say while we're waiting, actually, that we have, I did sort of make a vague promise last October at the Dante talk in Germany that we would be releasing an experimental multi-script version of BibLaTeX and Biber in sort of early this year that supports sort of much more multilingual stuff, so you can have different you can have bibliography entries that contain different scripts of the same fields, which has been a long requested thing for multilingual use, and that now does exist.
I can attest to that. I'm the author of a book here in Berkeley called Berkeley Problems in Mathematics, and which is the sort of the entrance exam for the PhD in mathematics. And the book recommends, cites a lot of other books that you should read in order to prepare for this particular exam. And these books exist in many translations too: Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, and Spanish, sometimes Portuguese, French, and German, and then we cite all of those. And the hoops that I have to jump through to do that in BibTeX are tremendous.
Oh yeah, it's painful. Yes. Well, the whole point of the multilingual stuff is supposed to be to make that possible, and it is. We have an experimental branch. It was an awful job to actually implement it, and it should be completely backwards compatible, but it has a whole new syntax in the bib file for multilingual database entries. So, and we have a manual for it and everything. So this is going to be a bit of a push probably early next year.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to thank you. There's one question that came up. How are people with social anxiety doing with remote sessions? I guess somebody's trying to get an consultation out of you.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, generally speaking, people with social anxiety do better with remote sessions, right? Because there's less social. Remote sessions are a different beast entirely. I generally don't like them that much because the kind of depth psychology I do, it's not just purely sort of chatting. There's a lot more sort of what you would call, tracking a lot more of the kind of feeling and tension in the room and things like this, transferential considerations, which is very difficult to do remotely. But there also are benefits. I mean, one thing you find, I found when I was training, seeing patients in the US, it was quite funny. One thing you find quite quickly is when you're having a phone conversation, particularly with no video, just phone conversation with somebody instead of being in the room, one thing you find is people are prepared to say things they would never, ever say to you if they look you in the face. And it's also, to a lesser extent, true with video. So actually, there are research papers on the fact that, working with social anxiety is actually doing it remotely or doing it by telephone is actually better very often, because it's a way to lead people in, because there's simply less social signaling going on, and people are generally, there's just less in the environment to trigger anxiety. So generally quite well is the answer to that.
People stay in their own environment and they can do.
Yeah, right. Yes, and they're not exposed to unpredictability in other environments, and so it's generally not so bad.
Interesting. Well, that was quite a nice conversation, Philip. I loved the interview, and I hope we can do this in person at some point in time.
Yes, when the world stopped burning and being crazy, and yes, maybe things will calm down a little bit.
Yeah. And when LaTeX 3 descends on us, then we'll have to.
That was the wrong statement, really, really, really the wrong statement, Paulo. I just told you there is no LaTeX 3 coming. You already got it.
Oh, that's my anxiety. That's my anxiety play. Okay. So, there is a question by Michael Top and asks, Philip, I'm going to translate a couple books and want to do it with LaTeX, of course, and bibliography, and it's an art book. So is it really hard to sell them to publishers?
Well, not. It just depends on what their workflow is. Some publishers will just be perfectly happy if you provide them with a very nice PDF, and so it doesn't matter how you create that. So then you're fine. It just depends if they have a LaTeX workflow that you have to somehow fit into. The chances of them using the packages you want are quite small usually. But it just depends what they want. It's not that hard to sell them I mean, like what I do. I mean, I don't even tell them I use LaTeX. They want some kind of you know, word thing at the end, and generally I just produce a nice PDF, and then I just use some you know, Adobe tool that turns PDF into Word. And while that's a fairly unpleasant thing to do, I mean, I get to work in the way I want, and then I get to deliver it in the format they want. So it's not so bad. But it just depends what they do. I mean, no, it's not. It's only hard to sell it to people who have very particular requirements and their own BST styles for BibTeX usually. Then it's a bit hard to sell it to them.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very, very much, and hope to join you in person one day sometime for a continuation.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you further.